Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview chat to our Classics Today Insider video of Giuseppe Sinopoli's 10 Best Recordings. I love doing these preview talks. I know that some of you may be frustrated if you're not insider members, which you can remedy very easily by becoming an insider member. It's a great deal. Take a look at the link below here. Go to the Classics Today homepage, either by the link or by yourself, and please sign up. It's easy. It's fun. Join the party. The more the merrier. We're having a great time doing these videos. But the reason I like doing these is because I get to talk about things besides just the person in question, or in addition to the person in question. We are going to talk about Giuseppe Sinopoli, but one aspect of his work specifically that I noticed, and which you don't see all that often, that I found kind of remarkable about him, and that's this. There are some conductors who care very deeply about what their records sound like. And they develop a very distinctive sonority on disc. Not live so much, but on disc, because I saw Sinopoli many times live. And I can tell you that the sound he got under certain circumstances was the creation of him working in connection with his engineers, and also quite frequently, although not always, with specific orchestras and specific locales. They had a sound, and it obviously was his, because they had that sound with nobody else to the same degree. And Sinopoli's sound was really very, very special. It was a somewhat dark, very rich, somewhat reverberant, almost cavernous sometimes, but very, very full and saturated kind of sound. It was very beautiful, very distinctive. I remember when his first recording came out. It was the Schubert unfinished coupled to the Mendelssohn Italian Symphony, and I remember thinking to myself, Deutsche Grammophon was never known for having great sound. It just wasn't. It was a good label. They made good records, but sonic spectaculars they weren't. And it's sort of understandable. They came from all different sources. They had the Bavarian radio people doing things. They were in Berlin, which never had a great recording venue. And so, except for the Jesus Christuskirche, which EMI was using for like Karajan's recordings, which was better than the Philharmonia. They tried all kinds of things. They had the Vienna Philharmonic, so they had different sounds. They didn't have a corporate sonority. Some labels have corporate sonorities, like Telarc had a corporate sonority. And I know, because I knew the Telarc guys, and they talked about it. Chesky, if you remember them, had a very distinct corporate sonority that they tried to get no matter where they were. Not Deutsche Grammophon. And so when they started recording Sinopoli with the Philharmonia in London, they got this really distinctively rich, yummy sound that I thought was very impressive, actually, at the time. And in some respects, in some repertoire, it still is. Some repertoire sounds like hell. Sometimes it was his fault. We can talk about how that sonority contributed to the success of his recordings in the discussion of the 10 best Sinopoli recordings. I suppose we'll do it more over there. Right now, what I want to talk about is just the concept, the conductors who care about what their recordings sounded like. Now, Sinopoli also, in terms of his interpretive stance, was a chord guy. He was not a line guy. He was not interested in contrapuntal clarity. He was a fan, a follower of the Second Viennese school. And he did not actually try to get that kind of laser sharp refinement, and he just wasn't one of those guys. Let me put it to you that way. He really wasn't. He liked big, bold, saturated sound and color, which is how he was as a composer as well. And so when he made these recordings, they were noteworthy for just some really lovely sonic ambience. And you could almost forget about the interpretation sometimes, whether it was good or not good. Quite often it was very good. Quite often it was not very good. But the sound was always lovely. and quite interesting. There were moments where I remember that the sound could just sort of get away from him. The performance could be all sound and virtually nothing else. That was true, for example, of his Mahler Sixth, which is so rich and thick and decadent. I mean, how does something sound decadent? I don't know. It did. It just had this sweaty, overheated quality about it. And they didn't quite go that far in the other entries in his Philharmonia Mahler cycle. But in that sixth, it was like, oh my God, they just got so in love with their narcissistic, navel-gazing sonic aura that they figured, what the hell, let's do the whole symphony that way. It was really kind of remarkable. Elsewhere, it wasn't that extreme. And of course, when he left London and started making recordings, elsewhere with other orchestras, especially with the Staatskapelle Dresden, which is a contrapuntal orchestra. I mean, it's an orchestra that was raised in the German tradition of long, clear singing lines. So the sound came out different, but it was still his. It still had that aura of richness about it, and that sheen to the strings, and that glow that seemed to characterize virtually everything he did for Deutsche Grammophon. Then he went to Warner. And when he started making records with Warner, I think that sound was largely gone. It was there to some degree. It was still, you could tell what was left and what wasn't, but not to the same degree because he was working with different engineers. So the Conductors sound is a collaborative effort. And that collaboration comes and goes depending on who the conductor works with, who the engineers are, and what label they are, and where things are recorded. It's a very, very nebulous, very subjective, kind of ambiguous quality. But some conductors had it. I mean, the most famous conductor, let's make a list. Let's talk about a few that I can think of who really cared about what their records sound like. One of them was Stokowski. He was the most famous. I mean, he was interested in audio technology, fascinated by it. He was involved in developing audio technology. He was making experimental stereo records in like the 1930s or whatever it was. He was definitely somebody for whom sound meant everything in a performance. And of course, we've talked about his Phase 4s and his various recordings of things with his own orchestra that sound like nothing else. Like nothing else in the universe. And so Stokowski was kind of like the avatar of that in its most extreme form. Another conductor who really cared about what his records sounded like was Ormandy. Ormandy cared what his orchestra sounded like. And let's put it that way. Whether that was always captured by the engineers was always a problem because the Academy in Philadelphia was not a very good venue. Everyone was always looking for a great place to record the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it was always a problem. It really was, because everyone knew they had this great sound, but capturing it in front of the microphones was terribly difficult. Karajan, of course, had incredibly strong ideas, like Ormandy did, about what an orchestra should sound like. And he also was such an egomaniac that he had very strong ideas about what his recordings should sound like as well. And he exercised dictatorial control over that. Unfortunately, as he got older, his perception of high frequencies diminished with his hearing. And so his early digital recordings and things were horribly screechy and, but a lot of the weirdness of the mix in his recordings comes down to what his preferences were. There were, moments where, the woodwind section might as well go home. When he did choral works, as I've just discussed, the chorus could be in another room. And he also had a very, very strange notion of dynamics. He believed in manipulating the dynamics. That is, the quiet parts were very, very quiet. And then as they got louder, a colleague of mine once described it as like having the orchestra on a movable table that comes sliding out at you as the volume increases. But he truly, truly cared about the kind of sound he got, for good or for ill. He cared. And so he got that kind of sound, no matter where they were or what they were doing. That was the Karajan sound. And he demanded that they get it. Klemperer, who we've also spoken about, had a very personal concept of sound with woodwind textures well to the fore. It was a very unsentimental, somewhat gaunt sonority in places, but full of inner detail and lively contrapuntal interest, which justified some of the slow tempos he adopted later in his life. And he was also interesting. It's very interesting because he was working with the Philharmonia, the orchestra that Sinopoli eventually got, and whose sound could not have been more different than Klemperer's, because while Klemperer's was a raw, sinewy sound with all of the inner lines exposed, Sinopoli was not, well, he wasn't a mud person per se. I mean, it wasn't all just a congealed, mass, but he was interested in blend. He wanted to hear sort of a much, much more dense kind of sound. And that's what he got with the same orchestra, which is quite interesting. But there were some conductors, I think, who just got great sound. They just cared about having great sound, whatever it was, and then they did their thing. One of the most interesting of them, an unsung conductors who recorded as much as anybody, but doesn't get a lot of credit for it, was Antal Dorati. Antal Dorati was one of those conductors whose records always sounded good. And he had the great good fortune early in his career to be working with genius recording engineers, that is, the Mercury Living Presence people, Wilma Cozart Fine and her husband Bob Fine, who was the engineer. Wilma Cozart began as Dorati's personal secretary. And Later, of course, she was married to Bob Fine, and they founded the label, and they worked with Dorati. So he had very, very good fortune to have received and understood the importance of getting great sound right from the get-go. And so after the Mercury era ended, when he jumped to Decca and also Philips, he continued to get very, very good sound from them most of the time. Almost invariably. Of course, there was like a bump in the road when digital recording happened and everything at Universal sounded crappy, except for Dorati's recordings. I remember very, very vividly when Dorati's Petrushka came out. And it was, first of all, it was interesting for the edition because it was a mixture of the revised and earlier versions, which Stravinsky had authorized Dorati to use, or so he claimed. But I remember we were all sort of going, oh God, these digital recordings, they're glary, they're terrible, they sound awful. And then out comes this Dorati Petrushka, and it sounded gorgeous because Dorati recordings sounded great. They just sounded great, whether you liked the interpretation or didn't. They sounded great. Another conductor who always got good sound because he cared was Charles Mackerras. One of the things I love about him was that he, in addition to being an interpreter of just unbelievable genius and range, he cared about what his records sounded like. And he made sure that his engineers captured that in as much as it was possible under whatever the circumstances happened to be. That was why he was such a congenial conductor to work with the Telarc engineers, who also cared equally about sound. It wasn't a guarantee. There is no guarantee, right? One of the conductors who worked with Telarc early was Lorin Maazel. And Lorin Maazel got fabulous sounding recordings for Telarc and lousy sounding recordings when he was with the Berlin Philharmonic, recording for Deutsche Grammophon in his early digital recordings. Why? Because Maazel didn't care. He didn't care at least as much. So that was another one. But another wonderful combination of conductor and engineers was, of course, Reiner. Reiner with the RCA Living Stereo people. I mean, that Ein Heldenleben from, 54, 55, somewhere in there, still is a demonstration quality recording. It was amazing. And I think that a lot of the success of Reiner as an interpreter, he could be quite cold. He could be quite seemingly disinterested, but his ear for and demand for analytical clarity and precision was enhanced immeasurably by the fact that he demanded and got fabulous recorded sound, and by the fact that had he not gotten that, I don't think his career would have taken off in anything like the same way that it did. Those recordings are legendary as much as because of the engineers as because of his conducting. And we can go on talking about musicians and partnerships with their engineers. There was Rubinstein and Max Wilcox. There was the absolutely demented sound that Glenn Gould demanded and got for his personal Steinway. The history of recordings is full of these unsung partnerships. They largely are. And we've heard some of it all along. I mean, one of the things we've been reviewing these large boxes. And one of the boxes that sounded fantastic was that Andre Previn box, the big Andre Previn Warner box. All of his London Symphony recordings, they were superb. And his RCA recordings were also mostly excellent. Previn was a child of the recording era, and he cared very much about what they sounded like. But by the same token, Warner issued a Riccardo Muti box with the Philharmonia, and the sound on those discs is much more variable. And it's really ironic. A friend of mine, I was talking to this with my colleague up in Montreal, Christophe Huss, who writes for Le Devoir, and he was saying, I don't get it. It's the same company, the same city. Okay, different orchestras, often is not. But why is it that the Previn recordings sound so splendid and the Muti recordings sound so awful sometimes? Not always, not invariably, but they were highly variable. Obviously, it was because the conductor himself, who ultimately approves the release of the disc, didn't care or didn't care as much. So I just think that this is a wonderful topic, and it may be that in the future I'll do a little chat about the best recordings by conductors who cared about what their records sounded like, and we can have a debate about some of those. That would be a fun list of stuff to do. And if you have some that you want me to mention or that you think should be mentioned that involve a conductor's best work on a particular label or with a particular engineering team, there are the comments. Let me have them. Have at it. But coming back to Sinopoli, whose recordings we'll be talking about over on classicstoday.com, I will tell you what I think the most remarkable sounding recording he ever got out of Deutsche Grammophon, and that was this thing, Strauss's Electra. Now, Sinopoli's Strauss always sounded wonderful, and he did wonderful Strauss. He did some in New York, he did some in England, and he did it in Europe, all over the place, with the Staatskapelle Dresden and with the Vienna Philharmonic in this case. And I am not going to give away the ghost by saying whether this is on the list of the 10 best recordings, but sonically, I can tell you it would be the best. This is the most amazing recording of Electra you will ever hear from a purely orchestral point of view. The end of it, Electra's dance of suicidal hysteria and, the final screaming and shrieking will absolutely blow you through the back room. It is the most astounding exposition of the complexity and richness of a Strauss orchestral score that I have ever heard, and it is dazzling. Absolutely dazzling for that reason. So I'm going to leave it hanging with this there and the mystery of Sinopoli's 10 best recordings to be unveiled and resolved at classicstoday.com, where I ask you kindly to become a classicstoday.com insider member if you haven't already. Remember, the link to join is on the bottom of this video in the description, the description there. And I look forward to seeing you over there. But until then, let's give some thought to the conductors who cared about sonics. It's just really kind of great that some of them did, thank God, and it furnishes us with plenty to think about. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.